Buenas tardes. Les saludo a Mauricio Nane. Yo soy el gerente general de sistemas aplicativos y quiero darles la bienvenida. Hoy en la tarde vamos a platicar de la seguridad. No es un tema técnico. Creemos que vamos a poder convencerlos de que no es un tema técnico el día de hoy. Pero le queremos dar la bienvenida a todos y esperamos que sea de utilidad para ustedes la charla de hoy. Más adelantito les voy a presentar a quien estará conmigo en esta plática. Muchas gracias.
CISAP, Sistemas Aplicativos. Durante este tiempo, hemos incursionado en muchas áreas de la tecnología de la información, liderando el mercado a través de la innovación, calidad y servicio al cliente, ofreciendo los siguientes servicios. Arquitectura. RIF-DR, equipo de respuesta a incidentes forenses Data Recovery. Ingeniería y soporte. PMO. SOC. Consultoría. Outsourcing. Capacitaciones. Y Customer Success. Realizamos operaciones en distintos países como Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Panamá y República Dominicana. Además, nuestros clientes están situados en Estados Unidos, México, Centroamérica, Colombia, Ecuador, Perú, Chile, Brasil y otros países. Nuestro SOC en Guatemala se sitúa en el edificio Forum Zona Viva. Además, contamos con un segundo SOC en la ciudad de Panamá. Actualmente CISAP está certificado como CERT por parte de la Universidad de Carnegie Mellon, que a través de su software, Engineering Institute, nos ha dado entrada a su red de CERTs. Nuestro personal cuenta con más de 70 certificaciones de SIEM, Malware Reverse Engineering, Penetration Testing, Forensics, Incident Response, entre otras. CISAP, con más de 150 ingenieros trabajando para sus socios comerciales, con más de 1000 certificaciones, alianzas estratégicas con Nova Coast, IBM, Verizon, contributor de Verizon, en donde CISAP contribuye generando reportes e información local recolectada, alimentando el reporte de este año, poniendo en el mapa la región de Centroamérica y el Caribe, que no habían tenido datos significativos anteriormente. También estamos certificados por FIRST, que es una confederación internacional de equipos confiables de respuesta a incidentes informáticos, que manejan cooperativamente incidentes de seguridad informática y promueven programas de prevención de incidentes. CISAP, Sistemas Aplicativos.
Bienvenidos de regreso, muchas gracias. Nos vamos a pasar en inglés porque la conferencia de hoy la vamos a tener con el señor Robert Vesio, que lo vamos a poner en pantalla ahora. Mr. Robert Vesio is, we have been really good friends and we have known each other for many, many years. More than we should be accepting. But Mr. Vesio is chief analyst, analytics officer and inventor of X Analytics. And prior to that, he was in Verizon and in Cybertrust for many, many years, where he has gained a lot of experience and knowledge about security, about risk, and about how to keep business working in security area. So, Bob, thank you very much for your time. Welcome to again this year. And tell us a little about X Analytics and what do you do in X Analytics?
Well, first of all, Mauricio, thank you again for having me this year. I really appreciate the opportunity. X Analytics, in the most simple terms, is that we're taking normal cybersecurity metrics and we're translating those metrics into financial outputs. And the reason that they're in financial outputs is to help executives as well as corporate directors, board members, better understand the cyber risk challenge that they have. And if that challenge is outside of their risk tolerance, it gives them directions on how they can either mitigate or transfer that risk so that they can bring it into a tolerance level that is acceptable for the particular organization. We spend a lot of time ensuring that the inputs are matching the organizations that we serve. Then at the same time, they can rely on the outputs to make those critical risk-based decisions.
Fantastic. So this takes us directly to the theme of today's conference. And the title of the conference is Security is Not a Technical Issue. So why don't we change the slide, please? Cybersecurity is a business issue, not a technical issue, a technical problem. And one of the things that we see all the time, and I am sure that most of our audience lives this as well, is that there is little knowledge and about the risks, and thus little budget to be able to manage the risks appropriately. So can you tell us a little bit more about what you have been seeing in all these years in working with boards?
Yeah, it's a great question, Mauricio. I think to start at the high level, it's important to state that every executive, every corporate director, board member, they are in the business of accepting risk. Every decision that they make, marketing decisions, real estate decisions, investment decisions, everything comes down to their ability to accept risk, and hopefully as they accept that risk, they have the ability to meet the needs of their shareholders or other constituents. With that being said, it's not about risk elimination, which is opposite of what we have been trained in and how we, from a culture perspective, operate within cybersecurity. In cybersecurity, we're very risk adverse. In cybersecurity, we always want to try to mitigate risk down to the lowest possible value, even though we know in reality that's not possible. But for the corporate directors and for the executives, they are willing to take on and accept some of that risk. Of course, there are risks that are intolerable. There are risks that could be devastating or catastrophic to a business. But they're not going to see that if they're looking at things like mean time to repair or the number of high severity vulnerabilities or our threat condition is 8 out of 10. It doesn't mean anything to them. So I think ultimately what I'm hearing and what we're solving for is that these board members want to be able to understand cyber risk in a financial context. And when they understand it in a financial context, they can make real business decisions. But in addition to that, they can also take it when it's in a financial context and they can compare it to other risk in their business, liability risk, real estate risk, sales risk. And that really gives them the ability to look at cyber like all other risks inside their business, which today, for the most part, they're seeing cyber as a very different risk, and it's a risk that they don't understand. And because they don't understand it, they really don't know how to allocate budget toward it or make really good decisions about it. And ultimately, that's the problem that needs to be solved by all of us.
Right. We will change the slide because next slide we'll talk about a little about risk and the acceptance of risk. Cambiamos? Mm-hmm. So now I need my glasses because I cannot read what we have there. So one of the big questions that board members and high upper management must be able to answer is, do you know your risk, your cyber risk? And many organizations are not calculating risk or are not even evaluating risk. Is this something you see very often in bigger companies around the world?
It is. And size really doesn't matter, right? You would think that the really big Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 companies would be the ones that have the most mature solutions, but that's not always the case. Clearly some do have a more mature cybersecurity practice that does indicate cyber in a language that's understood by the executives. But in many, many cases, what we see is where the chief information security officer wants to tell a story to the board. Of course, a story can be compelling, but a story isn't really a set of metrics or reliable, objective details that can help them make a decision. We also see that in the portion of telling a story, they'll rely on things like a maturity score. You know, we're a 3.5 on the NIST Tier 4 structure, or we're an implementation group from the CIS top 18 controls, or we have a maturity that's a 4.3 on a 5-point maturity scale. And even though that's interesting from a policy and procedure perspective, again, the executives really don't know what that means. If we're secure, or if we have a maturity of some high number on that scale, whatever that scale happens to be, then does that indicate that we're not going to have a cyber risk problem? Does that mean that we don't have to spend more money on our cybersecurity budget because we've already spent enough and we can just pause and use those finite resources in other places? That number is confusing. And we see that time and time again, Mauricio.
Yeah, that's incredible because as companies depend more and more on technology and the impact that incident or a breach can have in their infrastructures can be devastating. And we have seen many companies have gigantic losses because they didn't do what was needed, but they didn't know how to measure that impact. And that takes us to the second line there, that many times we're talking about, can we tolerate this or that risk? But as a matter of fact, we should be talking about the impact tolerance, not the risk tolerance. Because risk is going to eventually have an impact.
Yeah, I agree with that, Mauricio. You know, when you say risk, it's a bit of an arbitrary term. It can mean different things to different people. But when you say impact, everybody understands that impact is a result of financial damage. If you talk about the impacts of a hurricane, people think about property damage or human casualty as a result. But all of that has a monetary component that allows people to better understand it. When it comes to cyber, the same is true, right? So if we talked about the impacts of data breaches, if we talked about the impact of ransomware or misappropriation of intellectual property or business interruption, and if we put a dollar around that value, then now all of a sudden it has a meaning. It has a meaning that could be understood by the executives and the corporate directors, and then it gives them the ability to understand, whether that impact is something that they can tolerate or not tolerate. And we see this so many times in the news, right, where there's a relatively insignificant event, but then when we look at the impact of that event, it's not as insignificant as people believe that it would be. It's estimated that Facebook last week, they had an outage. Everybody knows about it around the world. It's estimated that outage for Facebook cost them about $100 million. That's a lot of money in a single day, in a single window of time that they were out, to be able to report back to the shareholders that they lost $100 million. There's people that want answers to that question. And so you're right, it gets to impact. It always gets to impact. And because of that, we need to start with impact compared to the other languages that we use in cyber.
Yeah, and once you can express the impact in dollars, it is very clear that it is a business decision. And business decisions must be made by business leaders, not necessarily by technological leaders. So this is the whole thing that we need to take to the upper management and board is, are we giving them the information they need to make these decisions or not? Because the decisions will have to be, as we will see a little later on, part of the strategy. The problem is that many times the strategy does not include the cyber risk or the impact tolerance of the company. Many times the company says, yeah, we want to do digital transformation, and we want to do this, we want to do that, but this other metrics or these other measurements are not in that decision. And then it becomes a surprise.
Right, right. Yeah, there was there was a world for a while, Mauricio, where the CISOs didn't want to represent cyber in financial detail for a couple of reasons. They were afraid that if they did that, and if the number wasn't big enough, then they would lose their budgets. By the way, that number is always going to be bigger than people realize. So I don't think there's any risk that people are going to lose their budgets. The other part is that if they know about it, then there's a liability. So some of the CISOs around the world have taken the choice of ignorance. It's better that I don't know that number, because if I'm in a publicly traded company and if I know that number, then that is a material risk that I need to report. And once I start reporting it once, I have to continue to report it. And the SEC is no longer accepting that ignorance is an answer. Under the new cybersecurity guidelines from the SEC for publicly traded companies, like on the New York Stock Exchange, there is an expectation that if you have some sort of material cyber-related incident, that you have to know the impact and you have to report the impact to the board. But then further than that, you have to report the impact out to the shareholders. You have to be proactive in your communication. And you've seen this. If you look at the quarterly earning reports from Equifax or some of the other companies that have major cybersecurity incidents, they are reporting those impacts, total damages, including their insurance benefits, in those quarterly earning reports. And it's something that they're following by adhering to those SEC guidelines. And I think we're going to see more and more of that, Mauricio, which is good, because all of this is going to help organizations better understand the reality of these events so that they can make better decisions than what they've historically have made.
Right. So this brings us back again that the chief information officers and the chief security officers should be producing information to the upper management and board about the impact size expressed in monetary value, and help them decide, but not take the decisions out of the board's hands, because really these are business decisions. These are not technical decisions. The technical decision may be how do I mitigate, or what's the price of mitigation, but the total value of the risk and the impact should be moved to the upper management. But the problem is that they haven't been able, because many organizations don't have the processes or the methodologies to be able to calculate that risk, and that's where X Analytics comes in. Now, next thing is, let's say that the board or the upper management says, no, this impact I cannot tolerate. These are the things that they should be doing. Why don't you elaborate a little bit on the things that they should be doing?
Yeah, I'll start with the tolerance too, Mauricio, just as a ratio. So, and then I'll get to the things just to help everybody better understand the landscape. In terms of deciding whether cyber is something that's in a range that's tolerable or intolerable, many organizations are using ratios. You hear about like PE ratios on publicly traded stocks. They use margin, which is really a ratio when they talk about the health of their business. But cyber could also be represented as a ratio. If you take all of the expected loss in cyber over total revenue, that figure, that ratio we call a loss ratio, can really help them understand whether cyber risk is something that they can tolerate or not. And that number is going to be unique and intimate to every organization that's out there. And a lot of it has dependencies on not only the revenue they make, but the margins that they operate within their business. So some companies may be able to accept a loss ratio that's 5% of revenue. In other cases, other organizations can't accept anything that's greater than 1% of revenue. But when they use that ratio and when they compare their expected loss due to cyber with that acceptable ratio value, then it allows them to make better decisions. In terms of making better decisions, one of the things that we do, Mauricio, is we take different technologies and we take the major control domains and we run those through what-if simulations, so that very easily they can see, wow, my total expected loss is 2%, loss ratio is 2% of revenue. That's an intolerable amount. I need to be less than 1%. And then very clearly they can see if I do these 5 control families and move those 5 control families from the current state to say 70% implementation or 80% implementation, then I can actually bring that loss ratio from 2% down to 1%. So it gives them a very clear answer. They know how to focus those finite resources. Now, when, just going back when you talked about the CISO, I really look at this the same as we look at plants and animals. There's a family, then you have a genus and you have a species. But I think the same could be looked at in terms of cyber. So if you think about the loss category, are we talking about data breach? Are we talking about ransomware? Are we talking about misappropriation? That's the family. The family is what the executives and the boards need to understand. So when they see that loss ratio, they can see which of those categories are most significant. And let's say it's ransomware. Because it's ransomware, they want to get ransomware under better control. They can see that there are certain things that could help them improve ransomware, like security awareness training to help reduce the amount of phishing. So they can give the stamp back to the CISO, we're giving you a clear pass, we're going to give you the budget to improve security awareness training. Now, once they do that, the actual mechanism of security awareness training, now we're getting down to the species, that's entirely up to the CISO of the organization, right? That's where they start to make their decision. And they may decide, we want to do mock phishing exercises to see if people are easily exploited through their email. But that's the level where the CISO really starts to become more tactical. But at the executive level, they just need to know where to focus. Where is our problem? And once they know what their problem is, then they can look at those major control domains. And once they know what those major control domains are, they can decide if that budget's going to be a positive or negative return on investment. Then the CISO can use that budget in a way that makes the most sense to the organization. I'll pause there, Mauricio, to see if that helped to set the landscape.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the things that normally are, we used to start the security, what do I do with risk? And we used to start with avoid it. And yeah, sure, we can avoid it, but otherwise we have to do things like mitigate and transfer. Yep. And transfer is not that big in Latin America yet, because this is insurance, right?
Right, right.
So we have started to get insurance, cyber insurance, and these in our space. But one of the problems is how to calculate how big of an insurance I need. And again, that's where you can help them. Tell me a little about that.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that we do on that front. One, if they already have insurance, we can take the details of their insurance policy, limit, sublimits, deductibles or retentions, waiting periods on business interruption, right? All of those little profile components. And we can help them stress test their insurance policy, which allows them to understand where their policy would engage and where their policy does not engage. And where it does engage, how much of that impact is actually covered by the policy. By the way, cyber insurance doesn't cover 100% of the impact in any of the cases. So there's always an element that's left over for the organization to absorb or to basically to take on the chin. But with that being said, they can see when they're stress testing, they can see, wow, that insurance policy I've had for the last 3 years really isn't all that great. If we had a significant event, it may only pay out 5% of total impact, which if you're buying insurance to pay out 5% of total impact, that's probably not a great investment. Right. I would be really upset if I totaled my car and it paid 5% of my car, as an example.
Right.
The other thing that we do is that if they don't have insurance, then based on where they do have expected loss, again, getting into the key categories, data breach, ransomware, business interruption, et cetera, they now know how to talk to their broker about which insurance components align to those loss categories. And they're not the same, right? So data privacy, insurance components cover things like a data breach. But if you have business interruption, that covers business interruption damage, which is always different than data privacy. But it also is a part of ransomware, because ransomware is a business interruption event. So, business interruption is very critical. Facebook, by the way, hopefully they had some sort of business interruption coverage for their event right last week. In addition to that, if it's something like ransomware, then you need to have cyber extortion coverage, which is beyond data privacy and beyond business interruption. So understanding those loss categories and aligning those loss categories to insurance components is a really critical step. The second step is to make sure that they are requesting the right limit. Now, this is something, again, that's very intimate to every organization. They have to decide where they're going to buy insurance and how far they go with that insurance. Now, a lot of times the underwriters don't want to take on a lot of high probability risk. So they may decide to eliminate risk by using things like waiting periods. Like in business interruption, they can indicate a waiting period of 8 hours, which means that anything that's less than 8 hours is not covered by the insurance policy. So that's their technique to eliminate the high probability events. But once that's decided, then how far do you want to go? Do you want to deal with a business interruption event that's beyond 8 hours, but up to 24 hours, 48 hours, up to 2 weeks, a month, 2 months? That is the other part of the decision that has to be made. So what we do is we show the impact and the probability for each of those loss categories for all possible scenarios, and it allows them to decide how far they want to take that limit. Many of our customers do not want to insure anything that is less than 0.05% probability, because you're really getting into a very improbable figure, and spending money on insuring something that's so improbable is probably going to be an upside down return on investment. On the other hand, those things that are beyond the retention and beyond that waiting period, up to 0.05% probability, could end up being a really, really beneficial investment. Again, Mauricio, I'll pause and pass it back to you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. And that's great, because definitely when you're not used to buy something, you don't have all the experience, it's very difficult to make a intelligent decision. For example, if I went now to try to buy a cyber insurance, all these things that you mentioned, if I don't have them at hand, I possibly will buy the incorrect insurance, and possibly will be paying, or maybe overpaying, or maybe getting underinsured. So it's very important.
Yeah, and the market's interesting to that point, Mauricio. With insurance, and I know that it's not as big in Latin America as is here in the United States or Europe, but the conversation is really controlled by the broker, the insurance broker. I mean, that's their job, right? Their job is to shop and get the right policy for the customer. But I think it's important to understand that the brokers don't get paid until you buy a policy. So the brokers want to operate as efficiently as they can. Now, if you're a big company like Verizon and you're buying a really, really big policy, they're going to spend a lot of time with you, because the commission on that policy is very beneficial to them. But on the other hand, if you're making less than $1 billion in revenue, they want to get in and out as fast as possible in that engagement and move on to the next customer. So you're right, a lot of times they control that dialogue just so that they can close a deal and move on to the next customer, because they don't get paid otherwise. And it is our responsibility, right, as leaders in companies, to make sure that we are buying the right policy for our particular business and not let the broker entirely control that conversation, because we all have different incentives, and our incentive is to protect the organization. Their incentive is to make a commission and move on to the next organization. So that's something that everybody needs to understand as they go into that insurance buying decision process.
Great. Yeah, thanks. That's very enlightening. And yeah, it works exactly like like you're describing. So going back to what can we do about the how to tolerate or how to reduce the risk or the impact, what are other things have you seen recently? You told me one of the things that I wasn't expecting is close one of the operations. Tell me a little about that.
Yeah, again, from a traditional sense, we think about cyber risk, and our first instinct as cybersecurity practitioners is to mitigate, right? It's always mitigate, patch vulnerabilities, close ports, deploy least privilege, whatever the answer happens to be. But there is a reality that when organizations look at, again, those loss ratios or their financial impact due to cyber, and they start to compare it across all of their different business units or product lines, they can start to see that, maybe there's certain products that aren't generating a lot of revenue for them, or certain business groups that aren't generating a lot of revenue, but carry a lot of cyber risk. And maybe they carry other types of risk beyond cyber as well. And, business leaders will decide, let's just purge that business. It's not really significant to our bottom line. In fact, it's more risky to keep it on the balance sheet than get rid of it. So they either sell it off or close it down. But that is a very tactical decision that is made by executives, is to purge things that are very risky to their organization, especially things that don't have a revenue growth potential behind them.
And this, again, is a very, very business decision. This is not a decision that the CISO can make. Let's close this business unit,
right,
because it's too risky. Right. He's going to get fired really fast. And the last one is very interesting as well, the margin protection. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so, cyber IT, right? All of IT and cyber is a cost to the business. And by being a cost, we do affect margins in the business. It's important to understand that. Cyber is not by default a revenue generation component of the business. Now, with that being said, there's only so far that you can go with budget. And budget requires that you make investments in either people or technology or process or procedures. But there's other choices that the business leaders do have. Like, they can actually modify the price of the goods that they're selling. Here in the United States, we have a lot of big box retail stores like Target and Walmart. And, if you really look at their business models, they account for the fact that they have theft in their stores. All of their stores have theft, shoplifting. And the way that they deal with that, of course, is with cameras and mechanisms at the door that can catch people stealing really high cost items. But for a lot of those low cost items, all they do is increase everything in the store by a few pennies. Nobody really noticed it from the business side, from the shopping side. But that increase in those prices is enough to offset what's actually being stolen out of their stores. That same practice is also used in cyber. There are organizations, either pre or post cyber incident, that are modifying their prices to account for their loss, so that by the time they get to the next quarter or the next couple quarters, they're reporting a very healthy margin back to the shareholders.
Right. So if my loss ratio is 1%, and if I can modify my margin by 1%, I should be good.
Right. And if you have a lot of goods and a lot of products, there's a lot of ways to account for that adjustment. The other side of it too is that they could cut costs in other areas, but we always want to think about growth and opportunity, because you can't shrink to greatness. So if you can actually increase your revenue by modifying, cutting cost in other areas of the business.
Right.
Again, this is going to vary from every business to the next.
Okay, so we'll change the slide now and go to another area which many times has been neglected. The interconnectedness of our businesses. Of course, during the pandemic, this has been accelerating really fast, and we are more and more dependent on technology. And technology is not only provided by the company that sells you the computer. It's a lot of interconnected things that makes this conference and any other business process possible. So tell us a little about your experience with interconnectedness and the things that are in the in the presentation now.
Yeah. So we're in a very interconnected world now. Not only are we interconnected across the different assets in our organization, Internet of Things is really the massive big introduction over the last 5-10 years. But we're also interconnected to our suppliers, right? People that make up our organizations make up our supply chain ecosystem. We're connected from all the people that are working remotely and bring your own device concepts that exist in many, many companies. So that interconnection is just something that's going to continue to grow. I don't think we're going to see a reverse on it anytime in the near future. Now, with that being said, there are ways that we can contend and deal with it. Specifically to the supply chain, of course, everybody talked about SolarWinds, the Russian-based attack, and SolarWinds being all over companies and all over governments around the world. But this was an area that was really being misunderstood. They would look at some sort of cyber ratings score for the vendor, and they might see SolarWinds as an A or an A minus, or it has some score that looks like a credit score that's really, really good. But it's not taken in the context, the purpose of why SolarWinds is even connected to their business. And if they are connected to their business, especially through a direct connection, could SolarWinds be used as a vector to gain access to the crown jewels that make up the business? Could they be used as a vector to cause a business interruption, to cause a misappropriation of intellectual property, to cause a data breach, or some other type of cyber-related event? And that wasn't really understood or foreseen in any of the other rating solutions that are out there in the market that many people were depending on in this interconnected world that we live in. Now, there are ways to assess your vendors, and by assessing your vendors, you want to start with the relationship that you have with that vendor. Is that vendor impacting revenue in any capacity? Is that vendor holding data for you? And if so, how much data and what's the type of data? Does that vendor have dedicated resources assigned to your particular business? If so, how many? Is that vendor a web application or a SaaS-based service or a platform as a service? All of those things are really important so that you can better understand the relationship that you have with the vendor and what that means back in financial terms. So if that vendor were to have a cyber incident, is that affecting your organization by a few $100s, a few $1,000s, a few $1 million, hundreds of millions of dollars? These are all really, really good questions to ask. And by the way, if you look at the most significant event in this interconnected world, you don't have to look any farther than Facebook. I know I've mentioned Facebook now quite a few times, but if you go back a few years ago, Facebook was using a third party, an analytics company, to make decisions regarding the data that they had. It was a misuse circumstance. It wasn't malice. It was purely based on misuse. But this particular analytics firm misused the data. The data included a lot of minors, so people under the age of 18. And the Federal Trade Commission here in the United States gave them a $5 billion fine. It's the largest FTC violation related to cyber to Facebook to pay. So, these interconnected circumstances get directly back into your statement earlier, Mauricio, about impact, and that impact can be very, very significant.
Great. Yeah, that's incredible. And many companies and many people are hesitant to do more and more business in the cloud, whatever that means to anybody, because of this interconnectedness, and we start losing control over the different parts of our business and giving that control to third parties. For example, only in this conference, we're using many providers of service to get the conference to people all over the countries where we are. So even in small things like this, and in big things like I want to run my bank completely in the cloud, in different areas of the cloud, you start trusting third parties, and the third parties have their own third parties providing services. For example, the DNS problems that a couple of years ago that was this attack. So it is getting really complicated, and also how we develop software now. APIs are all over the place. This statistic that I read today is 80% of all internet traffic is related to APIs. And many times we do not have an idea of these APIs are trustworthy. And the companies that are producing them are trustworthy, and they're keeping good tabs of their security practices. So not only the services that we procure, but the components of our software is being in a big web of different providers. Are you seeing a lot of problems with APIs in your customers?
It's coming up. Again, I think this is a bit of a blind spot, Mauricio. I don't think a lot of people are really monitoring what's moving through those APIs and what the result is. So, part of it, I think, is the fact that we just don't know, right, ultimately, as an answer. But it absolutely, everything you've said, it's absolutely true. It is another vector. It's another way in which data is moving in and out of organizations. And I don't think a lot of folks even know in the relationship they have with their vendor exactly how that data can be used and what the responsibility of the vendor is to protect that data. So I think those are all really, really good questions. Not to mention that APIs also can serve as a vector. So if an attacker wanted to use an API as a mechanism to get inside an organization, it is another vector that could be exploited. Now, with all that being said, I do think that there is, for quite some time moving forward, there's going to be a shift to continue to move more and more things into the cloud. I don't think that's going to take a reverse trend anytime in the near future or if ever. And the reason for that is that, again, it's getting down to a business decision. It's very expensive to pay staff, and it's very expensive to have on-prem resources. And if you can move those resources into a cloud environment, and if it's a cloud environment that's scalable when you need the scale, or if it's mirrored across different parts of the world, then it gives you the ability to really operate in a much more dynamic fashion with single points of failure, or I should say without single points of failure. And those end up all being really good decisions by the executives, right, on moving their business into the future. So I think what's really important is if you are moving stuff into the cloud, and if you are dependent on vendors where there's APIs, really better understanding what that means to your business, and as much as possible, put that in some sort of financial context. And once you know what it means to your business, then it gives you the ability to negotiate on those contract renewals, or if it's a new contract, on a new contract, where you can make sure that you have the right liability clauses, indemnification clauses, warranty clauses, so that you are protected if a bad event were to take place. But you need to know what you're starting with to even have the right negotiation.
Yeah, right. That is correct. And many times we're not getting all that context to be able to sit down with our provider of services or goods and have that conversation. We will keep on moving because otherwise we'll get stuck here until midnight. So cambiamos. Okay, so why are we doing all this? And basically all this conversation has been about it is good for the business. And as such, if it's good for the business to take start measuring risk, expressing it in monetary values, it should be part of the strategy. And one of the things that I see very, very seldom is that the CISO is not invited to the strategy table. Are you seeing this in larger companies as well?
It depends on the company, but it is a pattern that's repeated where they bring the CISO in for very specific conversations, but in a lot of the strategy conversations that include the other executives, a lot of times the CISO is not included. What is interesting is that the chief risk officer is included. So I think it's really important that the CISOs build an alignment and collaborate with the chief risk officers. I also think that if the CISOs are really to talk more in a business language, that they would be invited to those meetings. One thing that's important to note too is that those meetings, there's only so much room for negativity, and unfortunately in cyber, we sort of have a pessimistic view of the world. And when you go to those meetings, you have to sort of control that negativity. And if you can show forward facts or objective details, but then immediately you have answers to those particular problems or how those problems could be addressed, then you're really changing the dialogue. And I think that's mostly why they're not invited, Mauricio, is that there's only so much negativity that they want to have in those meetings. And unfortunately, the CISO by default tends to be more on the negative than optimistic side of the conversation.
Yeah, we have been accused to be the no department or the business inhibition department. Yeah. And yeah, we must learn how to speak the language of the board, which is mostly business and money, and to be proactive and bring solutions instead of bringing problems to the table. Absolutely.
Mauricio, something I'll never forget when I spent my time at Verizon. As a Verizon, I was a global director. And as a global director, Verizon made all of us that were directors and above, so directors, VPs, senior VPs, we had to take shareholder value training. It was mandatory. It was on an annual basis. But it really got all the directors to think about every decision that they make, whether it's CapEx or OpEx spending, on how that impacts shareholder value. And if you are making a decision to make an investment, how fast can that turn into shareholder value? There's a fuse on that investment. And I think that if CISOs, whether it's a small company or a big company, but if we go into conversations about shareholder value and margin, immediately, just in that mindset, we've already changed our internal dialogue, which is going to help us with our external dialogue.
Great idea, yeah. And we should be giving business training to the CISOs, because normally the CISO is a security analyst that is bright and very active and grows into the CISO part, but we're not giving him the right tools to be able to think as a business component, but as a risk reducer.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and definitely if cyber risk is not part of the strategy or in the strategy conversation, the budget is going to be very, very difficult to obtain. And I am sure that you have been in many, many board meetings where you have to be trying to convince a board that is not aware of the risks of getting the budget, and possibly about 95% of all the people that are with us in this conference have had the same problem, if ever they are getting to the board, because many times they're getting pushed back before getting to the board.
Yeah, Mauricio, we've been doing this since 2016, X Analytics, and the most often response that we get when we represent our data to the board for the first time is, wow, I've been needing this information for years. Finally, I have it. We hear that so often. But what's interesting is, even though we might be told we only have 10 minutes with the board or 30 minutes, once we start to get into our data, that 10 minutes becomes 40 minutes or an hour. The conversations always continue because we're talking about something that's exciting to them. And when it's exciting to them, they really want to better understand it. They're going to ask a lot of really good questions. And then, of course, after they ask those questions, they're going to lean over to the CISO and ask the CISO, well, what do we do about it now? And that empowers the CISO now to also give really good feedback on how they can address the problems that they need to address. So we tend to find that, it's always received with optimism when we show the numbers. Even if they're really big numbers, they're never frowned upon. They're just glad that they finally can see the data in a financial context.
That is good, really good news, because as I was commenting, that is the main reason that companies are not getting through to their risk reduction strategies is lack of budget. And lack of budget is basically you didn't convince the owner of the checkbook to give you budget. Yeah. Right. Fantastic. Now there's a couple of things there that possibly are out of the order right now, but I wanted to to bring this to the conversation because we're seeing that many organizations are doing the whole risk and security thing backwards, and many are beginning with testing. And I even made a presentation trying to convince people that pen testing is a fantastic tool, but it's not your first tool. It should be your last tool. And so let's see if we are secure by doing a pen test, which automatically I can tell you, let's save you the money. If you have that question in your mind, you're not secure. Let's start with people and processes, and then go to the technology. Don't buy technology until you have the people and processes ready, because otherwise this technology will be useless, completely useless. Many of the things that the technology is capable of doing, it will not be doing. And then things happen. And so tell me a little bit about your experience with this.
Yeah, I think it's misunderstood rigor, right? Which is really what you're talking about, Mauricio. It's interesting. You can buy technology, or you can have somebody really good on your staff that knows how to deploy a piece of technology. But for that technology to hold firm and do the job that it's intended to do will wane over time because people don't keep up with it. So with the right training and the right procedures and processes that exist, you're improving the rigor of the controls and the technologies that exist within your business. And rigor is something that does take time, right? It takes time to document every aspect of what you've deployed or what you're going to deploy. It takes time to do the training around the process or procedure to make sure that people follow it. It takes time to validate that people are doing what they're supposed to be doing, right? So that there's a manager or a director or somebody that's a senior that's looking every now and again, that's doing internal auditing to see if those processes and procedures are implemented in the right way. But, with all of those things, it's improving the rigor of the technology. It's improving the rigor of those control implementations, which really becomes the ultimate benefit. And you're absolutely right. If you started with testing, then you're going to say, wow, I got a bunch of problems. Now where do I focus and do those problems? But then once you patch those problems, you've ignored other problems or other areas. And then the next time you test, you realize you got a bunch of problems again. So it feels like you're on a hamster wheel and you're not getting anywhere. And the only way to really change that reality is through that better documentation, through that better training, and through the validation of the job that your staff is doing on a regular day in, day out basis.
Right, yeah, so definitely. And one of the things that amazes me is the amount of resources spent in technology and keeping the technology up to date, and the very small amount that is invested in people and get the people up to speed to where the technology needs it to be to have all these intelligent conversations and decisions made. And it's it's sad to see that the companies, let's say, are investing, I don't know, maybe 90% in technology, and in process and people less than 10% of their budget. So
Right.
it's like it should be a little bit more balanced. I don't expect you to spend millions and millions in training people. Well, of course, it depends on the size of the operation, but it has to be more so that they can really be defenders. Because one of the things that we see many times is that the attackers the attackers are very, very well practiced. They practice all day long attacking. And how many hours a week, a month, do we invest in defending? Very little. We're doing a lot of things to make sure that the walls are up, but we're not actively defending. So when we are getting attacked, many times we don't have the skill sets because we haven't practiced. And without practice, guess who is going to win?
Yeah, Mauricio, I think this gets into a culture perspective, right? If you think about the companies that people love around the world or companies that are really successful, they tend to have really good culture. Um, there's a few exceptions to that statement, but they tend to have a really good culture. And that culture always starts with the people and ends with the people of the business. They are the ones that bring forward that culture. And that's if you look at something as simple as like making of coffee and delivering coffee to customers, Starbucks. Starbucks does have a culture, and that culture is trained to every employee that works there. And they do have procedures extremely well documented. So if you buy a grande mocha in Guatemala, it's no different than the grande mocha that you buy in San Jose or in California or any other part of the world. And it's really important that with cyber, we learn from those other areas in business that are successful. And it's always going to come down to the people and establishing the right culture, and then ultimately ensuring that that culture is intact through better documented processes. One other thing on technology, Mauricio, that we see so many times is technology as a response to like a failed audit point, or it's the new shiny object, so the CISO decides that they need to have it in their particular business. But when we look at those technologies, even though they might be installed in the organization, the defense or protective features of those technologies in many cases are turned off or improperly configured. So even though there's a great CrowdStrike device or name your technology that's sitting in the organization, it's not really in protect mode. It may be in detect mode, but it's not in that protect mode. So you really have to start asking yourself the question, did I really even get my investment on that piece of technology? And again, if you had better people and processes, better culture, then hopefully those technologies would be installed in the right way and maintain that right configuration over time.
Right. So we'll go, we'll keep on going, and we're going to talk about how it has evolved from good practices and compliance. And this is a chicken and egg question. Good practices and compliance. And my response to that is compliance is the way the governments or let's keep with governments, make sure that people are doing good practices. But definitely good practices and compliance look the same, but they're not the same, definitely. And the idea in compliance is that make sure that the people are doing the practices. But if you're doing the practice just to get a check in the box, is it really helpful or not? So what could you comment about that?
Well, I think there are certain industry verticals where compliance is mandatory, right? Financial services, healthcare. Right. Again, it depends where you operate in the world. If you're in Brazil, there's a data privacy regulation you have to adhere to. If you're in Europe, GDPR. California, right? The California cyber laws. So, it is really important that you do put compliance in its context that it exists in, but compliance in itself is not everything. There are gaps in every compliance standard, and a lot of the compliance standards that do exist were mainly there for data breach related events. They don't really exist in the capacity of business interruption or theft of intellectual property or theft of funds like through SWIFT banking fraud and other things. And so it is important to understand that compliance usually only goes but so far. And it's your good practices and other security frameworks that exist that allow you to go beyond the purpose or context of compliance. And then for the companies that are not heavily regulated or the industries that aren't heavily regulated, then your sole thing is good practices because you don't have a compliance mandate that you're adhering to.
Right.
With those good practices, though, I think it's really important that you understand which of those practices are applicable to your business. Again, not every business is the same. So if you're a manufacturer, you need to have good practices around ICS and SCADA. If you're a healthcare company, you need to have good practices around healthcare devices and the protection of healthcare data. So I think it's really important to make sure that those practices aren't just adopted from a general perspective, but also aligned to the profile of that particular business.
Right. So from good practices, supposing that we are doing them because they're good for the business, and of course, and I think compliance should be like a sub-product of good practices. If I'm making my thing really good, compliance should not be an issue. It should be just a report to someone because I'm doing the things that I should be doing and possibly more. But then we go to after that, many of our organizations went to reduce the risk as much as possible, and it's good as long as it's business driven. And then we go to the what we should be doing very profoundly is enabling the business. So all our businesses and all our organizations are trying to go as fast as possible to this digital transformation. And everybody wants to be the next, I don't know, the next Uber or the next something with this digital transformation. It is fantastic. And the good practices in security should be the enabler of these digital transformations. I cannot see any digital transformation that is going to be successful if it's not secure. Tell me what you think about that.
Yeah, I agree with you, Mauricio. And I know we were just recently joking about the term shift left. I mean, that is where shift has a place, right? It's about putting security into your products and technologies early versus later. Which is, by the way, something that Microsoft talked about through the security development lifecycle going back. I don't know, Mauricio, I think the first time we talked about this was in 2007 or something. It goes way back. So there is this reality that if you think about security up front on the transformation that's going to take place, and if you can run what-if simulations to see, if we were to deploy this technology, what does our inherent risk look like? So without any controls in place, without security features enabled in that product or technology or whatever it happens to be, what is our world going to look like? And if you saw, oh my goodness, our loss ratio goes from 1.2% to 7% as we make this digital transformation. Well, we need to be proactive and start putting in security features so that by the time we do deploy it into production, we can keep that loss ratio intact or have it just move slightly so that it's still within the threshold of tolerance based on our particular business. But shift left concepts are all about that security development lifecycle. But the thing I really want to stress is having that ability to run those what if simulations. So if you can look at some form of digital transformation and understand what it means to your business proactively, it gives you the ability to address it in the forefront as compared to after a cyber incident has taken place. And of course, the cost at that point is going to be much, much larger than if you dealt with it from the opening part of the transformation project.
Yeah, great. Yeah. And we were joking about the shift left. Yeah. Definitely, if we have security and risk from the conception of the projects to their completion, it's going to be much more easier to manage that risk instead of trying to tag on or paste in security features and devices. So, and what the last thing that we should be, or the last thing the thing that we should be trying to achieve is operation resiliency. So, since our organizations are going to be more and more dependent on technologies and the cloud and everything else, what we should be looking at is how to be resilient operationally. Let's change the slide, and this is like a roadmap for resiliency. So let's start out with define, and this is again going back to the business. What are the business services that we're going to be providing, and what are the economic functions of these services that we're going to be providing, and define them and and uh, make the, thinking in Spanish, trying to translate, and it's getting more complex because my brain is running out of batteries. Trying to assign the values of these business services and economic functions so that we can continue down and decide these functions and services are going to be the heart of my company. And this is how we're going to do our business. And then evaluate your risk. So let's stay in the first one. Do you see that companies are sitting down and defining these functions and services as part of their risk, cyber risk resiliency? Or are they just trying to do something that's already created and make it secure? I don't know if the question...
It makes sense. And so based on my experience, Mauricio, I feel like what the cyber organization is doing is disjointed from a cataloging or from a categorization perspective. And what I mean by that is, they're thinking about the business as, here's all the Microsoft systems, here's all the Apple MacBook Pros, here's all the ICS SCADA equipment that we have that's from Honeywell. That's how they think about breaking out the business. But when you go to the business leaders, there's business leaders already at the financial level, right, for their financial reporting. They already have the business broken out based on the business services that they have or the business units, right? Whatever, every company's broken up in a slightly different way, but there's a definition of what generates revenue in the business, and all the financial reporting is based on those sub-business units. What the security team really needs to do is align their evaluation of risk to each one of those business units that's already being reported at the upper aspects of the organization. So if the organization had 5 different business units, then they probably want to look at risk distinctly for each of those 5 different business units, cyber risk distinctly for each of those 5 different business units. And the main reason for that is that the risk is going to look very different. You might have one business unit that has lots of records. You could have another business unit that has almost no records. You could have a business unit that does a lot of financial transactions, and that business unit has a risk of ADH or SWIFT banking fraud. You could have another business unit that has a lot of intellectual property and patent filings. So if there was some sort of cyber espionage event inside that business unit, it could be really detrimental to the business. But each one of those profiles then takes on a different set of answers, a different set of responses, a different set of tolerance levels. So it is important to align to the way that the organization reports financially out to its shareholders or other constituents. And through there, everything else that you have on this list starts to fall into place. One thing I do want to emphasize here, Mauricio, is that, we do a lot of work in financial services. And we work with companies that make up what we call the core infrastructure of financial services, almost where they're like a financial services utility here in the United States. But they also serve functions for other parts of the world as well. Your clearing organizations are a great example. When you look at a company that has a clearing organization where they're clearing those financial contracts through the New York Stock Exchange on a daily basis, and by the way, they may be clearing 30 million financial contracts every single day, the amount of risk that exists in that particular service, that service that's clearing those financial contracts, is very different than other risks that could exist in that business. In fact, when we break out the micro threat verticals for those services, we start to see things where, crimeware is not the major problem. It's not web application attacks. It's human error. Human error starts to rise to the top as the most significant threat. And the way that you're addressing crimeware or the way that you're addressing web application attacks may be very distracting when ultimately you need to be setting better controls against human error. And if you didn't know that, then you're just misplacing your investment in that particular service of the business. Again, Mauricio, I'll pause and pass it back to you.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Very, very interesting. Yeah, and definitely we need to again get our security people, our CISOs, on board with the business and understand the business and where the margins are being created. And then, of course, we have to evaluate the risks of all these different business units and understand the different threats, as you were explaining, that every business unit has possibly different threats. And once you understand that, you want to see how vulnerable or what your posture is against those threats. May it be human error or ransomware or whatever. So once you understand the threats, you understand where you are and how vulnerable you are, you set the impact tolerance. And we're back to the beginning. This is my tolerance. Right. And once we have where we are and how tolerant I will be against those impacts and how dependent I am with other providers of services and products, and I can start to analyze the different scenarios of how to deal with the different threats and what would happen. And you told the what if scenarios, and this is where we start playing. What if I get impacted this way, and the impact is way above my tolerance? What are the things I could do to reduce that impact? And finally, plan and communicate, and of course construct whatever is necessary to construct and operate. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Mauricio, just one thing to comment on that is that, we do see there's going to be volatility in threat values if you track it over months or quarters. Just threat patterns change, right? Ransomware wasn't a thing 5-6 years ago. It's been a thing of topic for the last 2 years. So it's important to understand that volatility. But, one ways of really looking at maturity of a business is when you see that volatility and threat, if the organization's expected loss is also moving rapidly up and down based on that threat volatility, that's a really good indication that they don't have that right culture and process and procedures, right? Going back to some of the stuff we talked about earlier today. But for the companies that are more mature and have that really good culture and those processes and procedures, as that threat is bouncing up and down, if you look at their expected loss value, yeah, it's moving a little bit, but it's not moving anywhere near the degree that the threat is moving. And that's really the aim of the CISO, is to try to control that trend line so that it's moving slightly up and down, or ultimately, hopefully, moving down over enough quarters. But it's not something that's moving dramatically, because threats are always going to move dramatically. And if expected loss is moving dramatically like that for your business, you're always behind the 8 ball, and it's really, really hard to ever keep up at that point.
Right. Yeah. Definitely, and this is a big lesson that we must all learn as fast as possible, is that we must try to mature our processes and procedures and the people that are going to create and run these processes to think that cybersecurity is a business, and they should be seeing it as a business issue, and we have to train them in business things. I remember a long time ago that some customer told me, I won't be here to receive you because I'll be in training. And I thought, well, it's going to be technical training. No, this is business training. But you are in the technical side. Yes, but this is business training, because I must understand the business in order to make coherent and intelligent decisions in the technical part. And this becomes so true in cybersecurity or in cyber risk, because and many times I think that we should be investing lots of more time and efforts in training our cyber defenders in the business. So we have been through a lot of content today, And I don't know, do we have any questions? Because I am sure that we are over the time. Yes, we are over the time. And and it has been really good to have this conversation, these many conversations, because this is very big and wide thing that we have been talking about. Ana Lucia, are you there? Do you have any questions? No questions. This is okay. We can stay here a couple of seconds to see if there's any questions coming in through the wire to see if we can answer them. No, there's no questions. So I think we bored them to death. Many.
It might.
Right. So, okay. Bob, I want to thank you very much for your time, for sharing your experience and your knowledge with us. And I certainly look forward to having a next conversation with you. I appreciate your time, and thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it as well. Thank you, Mauricio.
Thank you. A todos nuestros invitados, muchísimas gracias por estar con nosotros esta noche o esta tarde. Si tienen preguntas adicionales, por favor, mándennoslas y las contestaremos tan pronto como las vayamos recibiendo. Y les agradecemos mucho su tiempo y el esfuerzo de estar aquí con nosotros. Así que pasen buena noche y muchísimas gracias. Thank you, Bob. Have a great night.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.